Today, I wanted to do something quite fun. What we're going to do is spend a little bit of time building out a small diorama. And in order to build out this scene, we are going to need to start off with things like the floors, the walls, and things like that, which we can do quite easily with the Crates 40k kit from Games Workshop. To make sure that the diorama is the correct size, we made up a nice card template. And then what we can do is take the door sections from our Crate scenery kit and then use these to be glued down side by side, building out a nice tiled floor section. We then need to build up a back wall, and this will require a little bit of clipping. We have the option of the wall or floor sections of the crates themselves. These can essentially just be cut flush and into strips and then glued into place. This is where having a template can be quite helpful because we can use this to make sure we're getting the right height and also hold it in the correct position. We don't need to ensure that this is perfect in regards to when we're butting up the planks and things next to each other. Any gaps that are on the back or the floor, we will be coming back and addressing with a step later on. However, what we want to do once we've glued it all down with plastic glue is potentially do a little bit of reinforcement just to make sure that our plastic scene doesn't disintegrate and fall to pieces as we're painting it, adding bits to it, moving it around and things like that. I found the easiest way of doing this was just to take some UV resin. We just poured this down the back where we're not going to be able to see it because it's the back of the diorama, and then cured it with some intense UV light, which just gives us that little bit of robustness behind the overall scene that we've built out of the plastic pieces. Now we know the plastic isn't going to shift, we can mount the scene into our template. This one is made of card, but we could use plastic card as well, and it would work better if you have it. In order to mount this into the template, we are going to apply a thick layer of adhesive paste to the template, then push our scene down into this paste. This is where we can come in with some texturing elements as well. I'm going to go over and spackle all of the gaps and the edges with a strong sand paste. This will give us a nice rough earth textured surface. We can also blend this across panels on the floor by spreading it across the sections with either a brush or a sponge, giving us that dirt feeling going beyond just the gaps on the floor. We're opting for a Tau themed diorama here, and that's the reason that we went for the panel sides that didn't have skulls and a load of Imperium things over it. We went for just the squares and the shapes and things like that, which could be more generic and suitable for the Tau. However, we want to Tauify this slightly, and the easiest way to do that would be just to grab some old Tau kits that we've got some spares and things like that from, and then use these to make conduits and various different sorts of panels on the edges of the scene. Conveniently, we have some spare parts from things like a broadside as well as a Piranha kit, and we can use some of these elements to build out this scene a little bit more. Mounting some of the flatter parts onto the walls to look like things along the lines of conduits and panels and interfaces, we can then build out smaller elements like the inhabitants of the lab itself. And these are going to be made from the pilots of the Piranha, which come in really convenient Tau seats. Perfect to look like researchers in a lab. The fact that they would be sat down isn't overall an issue, because what we can also do is build out a drone, and we can make it so that the drone is being controlled while they are in its seat. So the drone can go around and will have various different claws, grabbers, and things like that, rather than its usual set of weapons. Mainly, we added these hands and claws for our drone from things like the AdMech Servitor kit. Once everything is built, we should be good to go back to the base, which is hopefully dry. And we did go through and build out a fair few other smaller accoutrements and items to go into this base. Mainly things like we made little desks, tables, and things like that, but we also made an operating table, and the operating table was probably the one that required a little bit of tweaking and things like that. What we did was take a part from a fantasy style terrain kit, and this came with a nice double-sided arch that I think was meant to go on top of a door or something similar. What we did is cut that down the middle, stick it together, and then add some Tau bits to it to make a nice technology-based themed operating table. Once we're happy that everything we need is built and ready to be painted, we can give it a nice zenithal spray. Then, in regards to the Tau scheme, we are going for a blue and a grey black. So we're going to want to mirror these sorts of colours into the base itself. We can start off by covering all of the primed zenithal panels with a nice blue contrast. We need to make sure that we avoid any of the heavy dirt areas that we applied, making sure that they are left white, while the contrast will give us nice quick blue base coat across all of the panels and recessing the shaded details nicely. With this layer of contrast complete, we can then do the same thing, but this time for the dirt, and we're going to be swapping out our blue contrast for a brown contrast. Once the brown contrast layer is dry, we can start to lightly dry brush the base in a couple of different layers and colours. The first dry brush will be a relatively mild application, and we'll be using a pale yellow, ensuring that all of the raised edges have been picked out nicely with this round of dry brushing. Following this up, we can do a lighter application, and this time we're going to move up in brightness to an ivory. This will bring a nice amount of white, near white brightness to the sharpest points of the model. We then don't need to tone things back too much, but we do want to bring it back down to a blue, so we can use some washes across various different parts. Looking at a blue wash for all of our panels, and a brown wash will cover all of the, well, brown areas quite nicely. This dry brushing up to a highlight and then giving it a wash, bringing it back down slightly and towards our main colour, is a nice quick way of picking out all of the details that is on this base without going in and individually highlighting every single tile, which, if you want to and you have the time to do so, go in and it will probably push up this diorama by a massive amount. But for now, for a video, I think a quick dry brush and we have a nice looking effect. We also did the same thing for all of the accoutrement and things like that. All of the little chairs, all of the desks and anything like that all got treated the same way, but we will be doing the Tau armor itself in a slightly different manner later on. There was one area that we didn't touch on that was painted slightly differently, and that was the table we mentioned earlier. And for the body of the table, we are going to start by base coating it in a brown contrast, giving us a nice dark location to build from. We will then be going for a metal bench. So once the contrast is dry, what we need to do is come in with a brassy gold tone and then overbrush this across the entirety of the desk, giving it that nice glint of metal. While we have this out, we can also pick out any of the details that we think should be metal on any of the rest of the diorama, things like panels and latches. Once the metal application is fully dry, so that we don't end up shifting any of those pigments of the past work that we've done, we can seal everything in with a nice dirty green wash, adding a nice amount of recess shading and a little bit of aging. This is the majority of the base scene itself actually done. We did need to go in and just touch up a few of the smaller details, things like lights, details like that. And how we did the lights essentially was we took a glossy white and we just gave it a quick layer, so we had a nice glossy base coat. And then we swapped it out for either a contrast or an effect paint so that we had a glowing green or a glowing red light, depending what we wanted and depending where the light was. With that all said, we do need to paint the guys that come in the Tau Piranha suit, and we're going to be tackling them soon. But before we do, there's a small addition that we're going to be making that means that we need to do a little bit of painting and then some little bit of building as well. So let's tackle that first before we paint the rest of the Tau warriors. These minor additions will mainly come in the form of blood effect. Lots of blood effect. We're going to be doing a two-stage process on the bench. And first we want to apply a really thick blotchy coat across the entirety of the bench. Then after a few minutes for it to partially start gelling up and drying, we want to lightly wipe away any of the excess with a paper towel. This will leave a strong amount of staining across a lot of the bench, as if past blood that has been spilt there hasn't been cleaned up fully. Once that layer and treatment of blood is dry, we can find the chosen location within our scene to mount the bench and then start to pool new blood across the bench, making a large pool in the center of the bench using blood effect and then pulling it down the sides of the bench and across the floor. As a final touch, we can also lightly splatter the full area of the scene by flicking the paint blood effect off of the bristles, giving us small drops across the scene. Now, as you can probably tell, we're going to be putting some sort of patient or subject on this bench. And I think the easiest way of doing that would be to have them experimenting on some sort of human. And I do have an image in mind. And how we're going to be achieving that is to start off by taking some parts from the Kazakin box set and using this as our human elements of our experiment subject. But what I also want is a mangled stomach, something like an operation potentially gone bad. And in order to do that, what I'm actually going to be using is a Poxwalker. I've got a particular Poxwalker in mind that I remember from when I painted the box not too long ago. And there's a nice one with the ripped open stomach and all of the organs in there. We're going to be nabbing that and doing a little bit of a kit bash to get the right sort of outcome for our subject. Unfortunately, the only spare Poxwalker of the right type that we had in the studio is one that has been primed, but overall that shouldn't be too much of an issue because of future steps. So we can start off by grabbing some clippers and a knife and start to hack away at the unneeded elements, things like the head, the arms and the legs. Once we have only the stomach remaining, we can move across to the Kazakin armor and start to remove the under armor sections of the chest. This will leave us just that distinctive flak jacket style breastplate. We also need a spare back of a guardsman to act as the back of our guardsman, and also some legs in roughly the correct shape that we want in order to match our vision. Then it's a case of using some plastic glue to bind all of these elements together, holding the parts in place, giving us a nice start to our captive. Now, we should probably talk about my vision for this project, and essentially what I had in my mind is that image of a workbench with the victim or subject with their back arched, almost as if they're trying to break away from restraints, or that the pain is causing them to arch their back away from the table itself or something similar. And now this is really easy to get with the effect that we've got with the bulbous nature of the Poxwalker. It's actually larger than the Kazakin, and we need to just make sure that when we build and position it, it's slightly rotated so that you can't see the massive back end of the model. Because this scene is meant to be designed as a narrow look-in scene, therefore anything behind it you're not going to see massively. So it's just a case of careful placement so that it looks like it's arched, even though it's actually being held down flush against the base with the bottom of the Poxwalker's back. But that is regardless, because whoever looks at the scene hopefully won't see that. If you wanted to do more of a flat lying subject, it might require actually going in and doing some sculpting of the entire stomach. It might be easier just to use a guardsman that is already flat and not try to adapt in a Poxwalker's broken stomach. But I'll leave that to you because that isn't the project we're doing here. But we are going to need to do some green stuffing, so let's get to that. As I mentioned, one side of this model is not really going to be seen due to the placement, but it's still good practice to go around, fill any holes and get the whole piece into an okay standard. So we want to make up a little bit of green stuff putty, and then we're going to work around and fill any gaps. Once we have all of the gaps covered, we're going to do a little bit of shaping as well. And this is where we're going to aim to create a fabric covering over areas close to the trousers and breastplate, and then use that to cover any of the gaps that we've filled with green stuff. We will be pushing, smoothing and pressing the green stuff so that it looks like it's coming out from underneath the flak armor and then going across the skin of where the Poxwalker is, acting as a nice textured fabric. Now, depending on your skills with green stuff and a sculpting tool and how much time you want to spend on this, you could make the most beautiful amount of fabric and it could be amazing. And to be honest, spend as much time as you are willing and happy to do so. I am doing this for a video, try to get it done relatively quickly, and we're going to be doing a lot of the selling of what the material is in the paint job, because where we've sculpted it and where we've got various other elements, as long as we paint it to look like the fabric it's meant to be, we're in for a good shout that it will read as that when the project is finished. So with that in mind, let's actually get to the painting of this guy. And similar to everything else that we've painted so far, we're going to be starting off with a zenithal. Kicking it off with the armor panels, we need a dark camo green, and then we can use this to base coat all of the various armor panels. This may take a couple of coats in order to get a nice, smooth, complete coat. But once it's done, we can move on from there to the first broad highlight. This first highlight is going to come in the form of a mix between our base coat dark camo and a slightly lighter camo green. This will give us a very small brightness change, which we can then use to pick out all of the areas in light, leaving only the darkest colors in the recesses. From here, we are going to need to start to build out a transition to a lighter, brighter green. So to get there, what we can do is a smaller broad highlight with just our lighter camo green that we used from our earlier mix. This will be more of a reinforcement on the last layers, just in a smaller area, before we do a finer highlight, this time with a mix of a camo green and an ochre tone, picking out the narrow sections where the light would hit the most, but still leaving us a little bit of room for a further edge highlight. This last ratio worked out as around 75% of our camo green and then 25% of our ochre. And what this does is gives us a nice starting point to move towards a slightly brighter, nuanced highlight, because we're not going just to a brighter green, we're making our green slightly lighter by adding in our ochre. We get a nice nuanced effect within the paint job. So next what we're going to do is push it a little bit further. Now we've got that progression started with the 75-25% mix. We're going to go for roughly 50-50 of these two and start with our final highlight. This green and ochre mix can be used to edge highlight all of the panels and the armor sections, while also making sure to follow our past highlight stages, giving us some nice definition, while the darker green recesses gives us a good amount of separation. This solves the armor, but let's jump across to the fabrics, which will be base coated in a dark brown ochre tone. And what we're going to do is pick out all of the elements of the undersuit, along with all of those areas that we sculpted as fabric earlier. With this base coat applied, we can undertake our first highlight by taking our base coat color and then mixing in the same ochre that we used as our armor's highlight tone. As normal, this first highlight will be relatively broad and be used more to set the mid-tone more than anything else. Finally, we can take some pure ochre and then use this to undertake a narrow highlight along all of the areas of the fabric. We did do less layers on the fabric than we did the armor, and the main reason for that is because there's more ridges and creases and things like that in the fabric, and it's also a less noticeable area and color and place, whereas the actual armor plates themselves are going to draw more attention, so we want to put a little bit more detail there, and also they're larger, flatter panels, so having more stages in that transition helps with the blending. With that said, we've still got a couple of elements to do on the man himself. We've got obviously the small things like lights and metallics, and those we dealt with in the very same way that we dealt with the scene itself. We essentially, for the metallics, so things like emblems, buttons and things like that, we essentially took a brass, gave it a nice coat, and then we went over it with a green wash. Otherwise, all the other elements were painted depending on what they were. Whether it was hair, would get a black layer coat and a quick highlight, or things like the lights would get a glossy white and then an effect or a contrast to give us red, green, blue lights, whatever we're looking for. There is one clear area that we haven't yet tackled, and this is the stomach and the rest of the skin of the model. Our open belly wound with all of those internal elements still lie waiting to be painted. And to start off in a really nice and simple way, what we want to do is base coat all of these elements along with the face in a dark reddish skin tone. For the layer, once that is done, we will be doing a broad highlight with a mix of a medium flesh and our base coat reddish skin tone. This will be used to catch all of the raised areas and areas that are in direct sunlight, while focusing on any edges of torn flesh sections a little bit more. Following this up, we are going in with pure medium flesh, and we want to do more of a narrow highlight this time. This is where we will be picking out ridges and edges before we do our final highlight, which will be undertaken by mixing in some ivory into our past mix. And then what we want to do is use this to edge highlight everything, bringing it up to a very pale skin tone. Painting the skin in this way and pushing it this bright has a few advantages. Firstly, we have the advantage of where we started from that reddish pink base and then went up. It is of a complete different colour to the greens and the yellows and those sorts of hues that we've used so far. So it's a nice separating noticeable element. Beyond that, we've also got the fact that we've gone very pale with the skin, which I think for someone that's potentially lost a lot of blood, as evidence from the scene on the table, I can understand why there'd be less warmth and flesh, blood warmness and things like that, because it's not in his flesh, it's all on the table and just completely everywhere. And that's not particularly good. And the final reason is also because what we're going to be doing next is coming in with a few washes and things like that to tint those internal organs. And in order to tint them more effectively, the brighter they are, the more we will see the tint work. We are using combinations of red, greens and purples, as well as a little bit of a flesh tone. And what we can do is apply these across the various elements that we've painted so far, and this will slowly start to tint all of the guts into a sickening body colour array, by making sure that we give a light glaze of the red wash across the edges of any skin ripped areas. We can imply that nice ragged worn flesh look. This solves the painting of the person, but we still need to finish him off by placing him onto the table and then carefully adding some more blood effect to the centre of the bulbous body wound. And then, similar to when we were doing blood effect for the table, we can start to pull the blood from the centre down into areas that it would drip into and pool before we pull it into the work that we did on the bench, so that it all looks like a cohesive scene. That finishes off the elements like our captive, the bench, and everything like that, so we can stick that down on the diorama. But what we do have to do is finish off the Tau warriors, or the Tau scientists, or the operators, whatever we want to call them, as well as the drone that we're going to be using in the scene. And in order to do that, I will probably do another video where we'll do a slightly higher quality paint job of this scheme. So if you want to see that, make sure that you subscribe, because it's not out yet, but it will be out in the future. So subscribe now and then you'll catch it in the future. That's how time works. But otherwise, we're going to be going over a really quick scheme here, and we're going to be starting that right now. Before we paint the blue armor, we will need to first deal with the undersuit, and we're going to start off with a base coat in a black contrast. This black contrast is why we don't want to paint the armor first, because if we painted the armor nice and blue and then we get this black contrast on it, once it's painted, it can be a nightmare to try and fix. So once our contrast application is dry, what we're going to do is apply a quick highlight using a pale yellow, trying to make these relatively narrow edge highlights across all of the leathery undersuit elements. This will then all be covered with a couple of coats of a black wash, waiting for them to dry in between each coat naturally. What this will do is help to desaturate and pull some of the colour out of that yellow, giving us a really quick highlight black look with some colour nuance in those highlights. With the suit done, we can move across to the painting of the actual armour. And here we're going to be starting from a medium dark blue tone, and similar to the guardsman armour, what we want to do is make sure that we get a clean, pure layer as our base coat. From there, what we can do is a slightly more narrow highlight using a mix of a lighter blue and our base coat, picking out all of the main edges and panels. Then it's just a case of doing a proper edge highlight, but this time what we need to do is take our lighter blue from the mix, but also then mix in a small amount of a lighter turquoise or teal tone. This will not only brighten up the colour, but also add the little bit of nuance that we like to add across all of our models and help to differentiate that edge highlight from the rest of the painted blue. If we've been careful as we're going around and doing our layers, edge highlights and things like that, we shouldn't need to go in and recess shade or panel line any of the sections. Hopefully the gappings between the Tau armour will be in our base coat blue, and then everything else will be brighter, giving us that separation. However, if that's not the case, what we can do is make an oil wash or a pin wash, or just go in with a thin down black or a thin down very dark blue if you prefer, and then pin wash all of those sections to give us some nice separation. However, we're not going to bother with that. I'm happy how this came out for a quick 2-day project. So let's not waste any time and see how it came out. Overall, I do really like this scene, especially given that, as I said, it was done over a weekend. I think that the Tau members could be done a little bit brighter, possibly pushing those highlights a little bit more, just to help them show up against the blue in the scene. Or alternatively, I could have perhaps painted the lab as a white, which would have made it a lot easier to see the Tau members and all the other elements, but also would have been a lot harder to do as a background because it would have all been white, which can be a nightmare. However, I do feel that I hit the mark of an underground lab undertaking experiments or surgery or some sort of procedure, and it fits in a really small profile. With all that said, what do you think? Do you think that the blue on the blue is a little bit too much? Should I push the blue a little bit more on the Tau, or should I have just gone for a white lab instead of a blue lab? What would you do in this situation? What's your preferred lab color? What's your preferred Tau sept for this particular project? And what would you have done with your operation victim? Would you have not gone for that at all? I think that it's okay to laser disembowel a member of the Imperium for the greater good, naturally. But you may feel differently. As I said earlier, we've got a video hopefully coming about painting this scheme and this sept a little bit of a higher level so that we can get some slight more fun out of our models and potentially use it for characters and things like that. But whereas that's not out, what you might be interested in is this video. This is where we went over a very quick, efficient and easy way of painting a box art style Tau scheme in that lovely crisp yellow armor. So why not check that out? Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.